Hi, everyone. It's Pastor Sarah Stobie, and I am here at Bayshore Lutheran Church. And the end of our year is coming to a close with our biblical literacy. And first, I thank you to those who have really hung in there and been very patient with me because the last couple weeks, as you know, I've been very busy. And I think you have been too. But anyway, I'm trying to catch us up so that we end right on time for December 31st. And this week I am at week 46. So week 46 is the readings from Acts beginning chapter 1 through chapter 19. And I'm not going to talk about a specific story today in this vlog. Instead, I'm going to give you a couple hints. Acts reads like a history book. It really does. And so my recommendation to you is to have a really good map. And if you have no qualms, if you are okay with it, I encourage you to get a good map. Maybe your own study Bible has one in the front or the back. And I encourage you to get a highlighter even, and maybe even make highlighted lines of Paul's first outing as a missionary, his second outing as a missionary, Timothy going here, just so you can see the whole breadth and depth of their traveling. That's hint number one to what I'm going to talk about today. The other thing about our readings for week 46 is that we begin obviously with Jesus. He's ascending into heaven, and then we go right into the Pentecost story. And the Pentecost story is often called the birthday of the church, which I would agree with that. Most of us know the Pentecost story, so it'll be familiar with you as you read through this. And then as you continue through, you see the development of the early church. And we also see the transformation, and I would even call it a reversal of fortune, as literary people sometimes call it, a reversal of fortune of Paul being with fortune and fame and a lot of clout and a lot of responsibility, being a persecutor of early Christians. And then he reverses all of that, and he himself then becomes persecuted, and he himself will die for this. Anyway, I wanted to talk though today about that birth of the church. And I even mentioned it a little bit too about traveling involved. For those of us who've had the absolute privilege of traveling outside of our cities, outside of our state, and for some of us outside of our own country, we have been able to witness church and churches in other settings. And if you've ever been to a foreign country, if you've ever been to a place where Christianity in Western Europe specifically thrived for hundreds of years based on, I don't want to say just governmental support, but support of the monarchy, support of the empire, support of the even dictator, let's be honest, support of, all of those hierarchies, supporting the church, funneling money into the church, building these grand cathedrals so that they would have the kings and queens a place to be buried. Let's be honest, that's why most of them were built, or for the Pope to be buried. St. Peter's Basilica, enough said about that. You just are overwhelmed with the beauty, first, it's true, of these gorgeous buildings. And you're overwhelmed with the history, and you're overwhelmed with just all of the sense of holiness. And I felt that when I was in Spain, going through cathedral after cathedral, just the sense of holiness and the sense of placement. And then we might come home. And for me, when I came home from Spain, that first trip I had outside of our country, really without family, I came home to Kalamazoo, Michigan, with much smaller churches that we're used to seeing here. in our own town here, Whitefish Bay, churches like Bayshore. Um, and it's just a stark difference. It is a stark difference. But I think we have a lot to learn from our reading in Acts for this week, week 46. And that is when the church began, it began with nothing. It didn't even begin with a simple, humble church like, that are surrounding us here in Whitefish Bay. It didn't begin with those cathedrals. It didn't begin with those massive monuments of faith and remembrance. It began in people's living rooms. It began in people's, well, I'm saying living rooms, but to be honest, when I say living room, I don't mean a room set aside for guests when they come to your house like you might have now. I mean their living room. These people that are featured here in Acts about starting the churches in these smaller cities that Paul and Peter go to see, Ephesus, that great city, it didn't have a great church at the time of Acts. It had people's living rooms. And living rooms as in that's where they lived. Maybe the kitchen is in one corner, the bed is in the other corner, and maybe there might have been an area for people to gather just to talk and pray, eat food, and go over whatever piece, scroll that they might have gotten of scripture, or in many cases, as we get more into Acts, letters from Paul to someone who owned one of these living spaces that the small group of Christians would meet and talk about. Now, surely I know, and you're going to say, but there were synagogues. Yes, there were. But again, those synagogues are not like the synagogues that you might see in larger cities. They're not like the synagogue that you might even see if you were to go to what is now some of these cities, modern, the modern city for these names. Those synagogues were still small, and they were usually in homes. Maybe the rabbi's home might have been a little bigger. Okay. Now, when I went to Israel and I went to Capernaum, I was on a tour and I was shown a synagogue in Capernaum that the tour guide said, this is a synagogue. We know it's a synagogue. Was it the synagogue that Jesus came to? I cannot 100% tell you it was, but it was the synagogue that was here at the time of Jesus. And so he said, with some religious imagination, you can tell yourself that if he was going to go to a synagogue in Capernaum, this is probably the one it was. And that's probably true. I cannot tell you how small it was. So there was this outdoor space in the synagogue that would have been kind of like our parking lot here at Bayshore, but much smaller, much, much smaller. And then there was a building which was probably the size of Kate's and my office here at Bayshore. Again, we're talking really small. We're talking really small, my friends. So people would flood into these smaller spaces to hear Peter talk about Jesus, to hear Paul at a synagogue talk about Jesus. And then as the synagogues began the split from those who were following just Christ alone, and they were Christian first, they had Gentile believers, they didn't have a Jewish background. So as those communities began to form, they formed outside of the synagogue. And when they formed outside of the synagogue, they were in those living rooms, those living spaces. Okay, so why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because I feel that somewhere along generations from the very humble beginnings of the early church, which yes, some began in the synagogue, but again, small, and mostly began in the living rooms of people, again, small, that from that grew into what we now see the history of in our massive cathedrals. And we have a few here in Milwaukee as well, massive cathedrals who have a lot of space and fewer people in it. And it can be really depressing. It can be really depressing going into a church that is large and there are less people in it. However, as I was reading through the Gospels with you all in our biblical lit, and as I began the reading of Acts just this past week, Acts was a really good reminder for me as a pastor and as a believer of Jesus that small and humble is not bad. And from small and humble can grow great things. And from small and humble can maybe even be a more authentic experience of faith and your faith journey. And it also allows some more conversation. So maybe, my friends, we are seeing a decline in the American Protestant church, and maybe we have a lot more space than what we need. Maybe it's time to figure out how we can fill that space with other things and also not be depressed and discouraged by the few that remain. Paul was never depressed walking into one of those living rooms and maybe having 6 or 8 people there. And yes, from those 6 or 8 people, when he first established these small little communities, they grew. And you see that in Acts, it says that, 100 people were baptized, 500 people were baptized, 1,000 people were baptized. It didn't happen overnight. And I know that as you read Acts, you think, wow, 1,000 people were baptized, Pastor Sarah. What'd they do? Line up? No, it didn't happen overnight. What Luke is doing in our reading is saying that Paul went to that place, and after Paul left, 1,000 people. Now that could have happened over several years. But Luke, in his way of trying to be a historian, is trying to say how that church grew. But it didn't grow overnight, and it didn't grow in a month. And it took time, and it took some traveling. So, my friends, I guess as we think about Acts, and as you are reading through this, I want you to think about that small, humble church that Paul and Peter and the rest of the disciples planted here, there, and everywhere, and how it did blossom and grow, but it took time, and how they didn't see the great cathedrals being built. They only knew the people, and they only knew these small settings. And I think that we, especially as Christians today, we need to remember that too, that what we do today matters. And even if it's a small group of people in our churches, individual churches all over the city of Milwaukee or the state or the country, what we do matters. And what we are doing is planting seeds. And with a lot of prayer and a lot of trust in God's word, our seeds will continue to grow. And someday, maybe there will be large overflowing churches everywhere again. But it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of prayer, and it's going to take a lot of seed planting. So, my friends, until next time, keep reading. Next week is week 47, and I hope you join me for that as well, too. Blessings and peace.